You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail. And it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
As Lake Tahoe's waterline kept sinking during the historic 2024 drought, something disturbing began to emerge from beneath America's clearest lake. The drought, described by scientists as the worst in over 1,200 years, dropped the shoreline nearly 9 feet, uncovering objects that had remained hidden for decades. Yeah, Tahoe's massive size means the water level changes much slower compared to lakes like Folsom or Shasta. But now the lake has already fallen to its lowest point in 4 years, and it's still dropping. But what appeared along the shore was only the beginning. The real shock came from footage captured nearly 1,600 feet below the surface by remotely operated underwater vehicles. And whatever they recorded was far more unsettling than anyone expected. It was not Tahoe Tessie, the legendary creature locals have whispered about since the 1800s. It was not a lost shipwreck or some strange animal hidden in the depths. It was something much quieter, much older. And once you understand what's sitting at the bottom of Lake Tahoe, you will never look at the lake the same way again. Because Tahoe was almost designed to hide things. To understand what those deep water cameras found, you first need to understand why Lake Tahoe became one of the perfect places on Earth for things to disappear forever. Located on the border of California and Nevada, Lake Tahoe sits more than 6,200 feet above sea level in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It is the largest alpine lake in North America and the second deepest lake in the United States, with only Oregon's Crater Lake reaching greater depths. Millions of years ago, powerful geological shifts ripped open the basin beneath Tahoe, forming steep underwater walls that plunge more than 1,645 feet into darkness. The conditions down there are brutal. The water is cold enough to kill an unprotected swimmer in less than 20 minutes, yet at the same time, it is so incredibly clear that from the surface, you can often see more than 70 feet into the depths below. The lake rarely warms above 42 degrees. That clarity exists because Tahoe is almost biologically empty. The granite basin surrounding the lake provides very few nutrients, while the freezing temperatures suppress biological activity. Very little lives there, and that near-sterile environment is exactly what made Tahoe world famous. It is also why any pollution near the surface would normally become visible almost immediately. But here is the detail most tourists never hear about. Once something sinks beyond roughly 1,500 feet, Lake Tahoe stops behaving like an ordinary lake. The depths function more like a giant sealed vault. The freezing temperatures slow decomposition to a crawl. Extreme pressure traps gases underwater so nothing rises back to the surface. Sunlight never reaches the bottom, preventing chemical reactions that would normally break objects down over time. Anything that sinks deep enough enters a kind of suspended preservation. And it can remain there for decades, for generations, for more than 70 years. That is what Lake Tahoe truly became. Not just a natural wonder, but a hidden storage chamber beneath the mountains. And the story of how it happened begins after World War II. Before the 1940s, Tahoe was remote and difficult to access. Winters made many roads nearly impassable, and only a handful of wealthy visitors traveled there regularly. Much of the area remained untouched wilderness. Then the war changed everything. Military facilities were built throughout the region, transportation routes improved, and thousands of soldiers stationed nearby experienced Tahoe for the first time. When the war ended, Many returned with money, cars, and plans to vacation there permanently. By the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, Tahoe exploded with development. Casinos opened across the Nevada side. Resorts and hotels spread rapidly around the shoreline. Small summer cabins transformed into permanent communities almost overnight. But the boom created another problem: waste, massive amounts of it, construction debris from non-stop development, sewage from the growing population, industrial chemicals from businesses supporting casinos and tourism, broken machinery, abandoned equipment, old vehicles. Everything had to be disposed of somewhere. And during the 1950s, environmental regulations barely existed. Hazardous waste laws were still in their infancy, and hauling garbage over mountain roads was expensive. Lake Tahoe, deep and seemingly endless, became the easiest solution. So at night, things were dumped into the water. Construction crews pushed debris directly into the lake. Businesses disposed of chemicals that would later be considered highly toxic. Old cars were shoved off cliffs and left to sink with gasoline and oil still inside them. This was not unique to Tahoe. Lakes across America were treated like dumping grounds during that era. But Tahoe was different. Its incredible depth and unusual underwater chemistry preserved almost everything that entered it. Instead of decomposing, the material simply disappeared into darkness and stayed there. As environmental awareness grew during the 1960s and 1970s, regulations finally tightened. Officials began closely monitoring the Tahoe Basin because even small changes in water clarity became impossible to ignore. But one thing never really happened. Nobody explored the deepest parts of the lake. The technology was limited. The cost was enormous. And honestly, many people preferred not to know what might still be sitting at the bottom. From the surface, Tahoe still looked pristine. The water remained crystal clear, and what had been dumped decades earlier stayed hidden far below, out of sight and out of mind. For nearly 70 years, that silence remained untouched. Then came the drought. Years of weak snowfall and record-low Sierra Nevada snowpack slowly reduced the lake's inflow. Streams feeding Tahoe weakened into trickles while evaporation continued pulling water away. And little by little, the lake level dropped. 9 feet may not sound dramatic for a lake over 1,600 feet deep, but along the shoreline, that retreat exposed areas that had remained underwater for decades. And as the water pulled back, people started seeing things that were never supposed to resurface. The first discoveries came from ordinary people, walking along stretches of shoreline that had not been exposed in decades. Hikers started spotting strange objects half buried in the sand: rusted tires, broken bottles, twisted metal too corroded to identify. At first, it looked like nothing more than old litter uncovered by the falling water. Then, the divers arrived. One of the key people involved was Colin West, founder of the non-profit organization Clean Up the Lake. For years, his team had been diving around Tahoe's perimeter, removing trash from the water one piece at a time. 72 miles and more than 20,000 pieces of trash later, the Clean Up the Lake effort in Lake Tahoe is preparing to embark on their final mission. What a huge mission it was. Joining us now to talk about this final dive is the founder and executive director of Clean Up the Lake, Colin West. Thanks for being here, Colin. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. By the summer of 2024, West's crews were working in shallow areas that divers had not been able to reach for generations because of the lake's previously higher water levels. And that is when the discoveries stopped looking like simple garbage. They started finding cars, not just one or two, dozens of them. Vehicles from the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s resting silently beneath the surface. Some looked as though they had been intentionally driven into the lake. Others appeared to have been pushed from cliffs or dragged in from nearby access roads. Many were clustered around old shoreline routes that no longer exist today. But the truly unsettling part was their condition. In most lakes, submerged vehicles quickly decay into rusted shells. Lake Tahoe was different. The freezing temperatures had slowed corrosion so dramatically that some vehicles still looked eerily intact. Faded paint remained visible. Steering wheels, seats, and dashboards could still be recognized. According to Colin West, there were moments when his dive lights would suddenly reveal a perfectly preserved 1950s sedan in the darkness. And his first reaction was not curiosity, it was panic. For a split second, he wondered whether somebody was still sitting inside. Think about how disturbing that is. A diver in 2024 approaches a car that may have been underwater since the Eisenhower administration, yet the vehicle still appears recent enough to trigger the same instinct you would feel passing a wrecked car on the side of a highway. That is how well Tahoe preserves things. Some cars still had readable license plates, others still had functioning door handles attached. One registration number reportedly traced back to a vehicle that had never officially been reported stolen. It simply vanished into the lake decades ago, and eventually everyone stopped asking questions. But strangely, the cars were not the most disturbing discovery. Finding old vehicles underwater is unusual, but not unheard of. What terrified researchers was what those vehicles were resting on top of. And if stories like this fascinate you, the kind where forgotten places hide secrets older than most people watching, make sure to subscribe. We dive into the mysteries powerful people hoped would stay buried, and this story goes much deeper, because beneath those cars, the lake was hiding something far worse. The Clean Up the Lake team eventually began working alongside researchers from the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, the same institution that has monitored Lake Tahoe's famous water clarity since the late 1960s. As the search expanded into deeper water, scuba divers could no longer safely continue the operation. So they sent remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, equipped with high-powered lights, HD cameras, robotic sample arms, and cables long enough to descend toward the basin floor. At first, the deeper footage revealed more of what the teams already expected: additional vehicles, scattered debris, evidence of decades of careless dumping. Then the ROVs descended past 1,000 feet, and everything changed. Sunlight disappeared completely. Temperatures hovered permanently in the low 40s. The pressure at those depths became strong enough to crush an unprotected human body. Yet the debris continued. At around 1,400 feet, the cameras illuminated something the operators could not immediately identify. Large cylindrical shapes scattered across the lake bed. Barrels, industrial drums, the kind commonly used to store chemicals and hazardous materials. This was the moment Colin West later described as impossible to forget. Imagine sitting inside a warm research cabin, holding a cup of coffee, staring at a monitor, while the camera drifts across what looks like an underwater dumping ground frozen in time. Rows of massive metal drums sitting silently in total darkness, exactly where they were abandoned decades earlier. Some still carried visible labels, manufacturer markings, chemical codes, handling instructions, and the worst part was realizing the camera lights could not show the full scale of it. First, you see one barrel, then three, then entire clusters stretching beyond the edge of the screen. The operator pans the camera farther, and more barrels emerge from the darkness behind them. Then, even more. The field never seems to end. That was the moment the team realized they were not looking at dozens of containers. They were likely looking at hundreds, and industrial drums do not accidentally end up 1,400 feet underwater. They do not roll into lakes by themselves. Someone brought them there intentionally and dumped them in a place they believed nobody would ever reach. The ROVs spent hours surveying the site. The layout suggested the dumping happened repeatedly over many years. Some barrels had been discarded in groups. Others appeared scattered individually across the basin floor. Some likely sank immediately after being dropped. Others may have drifted before finally settling into the darkness. But the most disturbing discovery came even deeper, near 1,600 feet, close to the operational limit of the ROVs. Those barrels looked different. Larger, stronger, more heavily reinforced. And unlike the others, some of them were actively leaking. The cameras captured cloudy plumes, slowly escaping from ruptured containers. In the still freezing water, the material did not disperse quickly. Instead, it hovered like smoke underwater, spreading slowly through the darkness around the drums. Water samples were collected as close to the leaking barrels as safely possible and sent to laboratories at the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. What researchers found shocked even longtime scientists studying the lake. Dr. Jeffrey Schladow, who had spent decades monitoring Tahoe's environmental health, had already documented the lake's gradual decline in water clarity over the years. But these test results were something entirely different. The samples contained dangerously high levels of heavy metals, lead concentrations hundreds of times above safety limits, along with mercury, cadmium, arsenic, and industrial solvents that modern environmental laws classify as hazardous, toxic waste. The barrels appeared to contain chemical byproducts from mid-20th century industries, waste that someone decided was cheaper to dump into Lake Tahoe than dispose of properly. For decades, the lake's incredible depth kept the secret hidden. But eventually, the truth surfaced. Researchers later reconstructed a likely timeline. Most of the dumping appears to have happened between the late 1940s and mid-1960s, exactly during Tahoe's explosive casino and construction boom. The chemicals matched industries operating around the basin during that period: automotive shops, metal processing operations, industrial laundries serving casinos and hotels, dry cleaners, paint manufacturers, photography labs, and other businesses that generated dangerous chemical waste. And during the 1950s, proper disposal was expensive. Dumping it into the deepest lake around was easier. Back in the 1950s, most companies did not even need to dispose of hazardous waste legally. And because of that, dumping it into Lake Tahoe became the easiest option. The thinking behind it was brutally simple. Tahoe was unimaginably deep. Whatever disappeared beneath the surface was gone for good. The freezing temperatures would slow decay. The darkness would keep everything hidden. And because the deep water rarely mixed with the upper layers, people assumed any contamination would stay trapped at the bottom forever. For decades, that assumption seemed correct. Scientists monitored the surface water while the deep lake was largely ignored. Since nobody could easily reach the bottom, it was simply assumed to be untouched and pristine. But nothing stays sealed forever. Even in freezing water, metal eventually corrodes. Drums crack, seals weaken, chemicals leak. And this is where Dr. Jeffrey Schladow's research completely changed the story. When his team analyzed water samples from different depths, they discovered traces of heavy metals much closer to the surface than anyone expected. The contamination was no longer staying isolated at the bottom. It had already begun moving upward through the lake, slowly, silently, for years. That changes everything. Think about what Lake Tahoe means to people today. Families vacation there every summer. Kids leap from docks into the water. Tourists drink from taps connected to the lake. Fishermen catch trout in waters that millions still believe are untouched wilderness. But every one of those moments now exists downstream from toxic barrels dumped decades ago. And chemicals like lead, mercury, and arsenic do not simply disappear with time. They remain. Whatever was sealed inside those containers is still there, and the fraction already leaking out is no longer trapped 1,600 feet below the surface. It is moving through the lake itself. The terrifying reality is this: Tahoe's waters may not have been truly pristine for decades. The contamination was simply too deep and too diluted for traditional monitoring systems to notice until now. But the toxic barrels were not the only thing discovered in the darkness. This is where the story becomes even more disturbing. Because according to multiple accounts connected to the ROV surveys, investigators also encountered objects that did not match industrial dumping at all. Personal belongings, suitcases, fragments of clothing preserved by the freezing temperatures, and in several areas, shapes on the lakebed that operators reportedly struggled to explain. Lake Tahoe has long carried rumors the tourism industry rarely discusses publicly. During the casino boom years, organized crime operated heavily throughout the Tahoe-Reno corridor. Different criminal groups fought for influence over gambling operations, money, and territory. And according to decades of local legends, some people who disappeared during that era were never meant to be found again. We've talked before in Northern California, legends about the rumors of bodies preserved at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. There's never been proof, but with water that cold and that deep, people always wondered if bodies could remain preserved down there, especially if organized crime was involved. For years, most people treated those stories as urban legends, creepy campfire tales locals repeated to tourists. But the new footage suggests there may have been truth behind the rumors all along. Now, it is important to be careful here because this section of the investigation has not been fully released publicly. Environmental findings about the toxic barrels have been openly discussed. The same cannot be said for every piece of footage recovered from the deeper surveys. Several portions reportedly remain under review by the FBI and the Washoe County Sheriff's Office. However, according to comments shared privately with regional reporters, members of the ROV teams described seeing what appeared to be human remains in multiple deep-water locations, and the condition of those remains shocked even experienced operators. The freezing temperatures, low oxygen levels, and lack of scavenging organisms may have preserved soft tissue far beyond what anyone thought possible. Not skeletons, not scattered bones, bodies still partially intact after decades underwater. One ROV operator reportedly told a Reno journalist only a single sentence afterward, "I still have trouble sleeping after that shift." Just stop and think about that for a moment. These are not ancient archaeological discoveries buried beneath mud. These are people, still wearing clothing, still lying in the same positions they were in when they entered the water decades ago. In a normal lake, nature would have erased those traces long ago. Lake Tahoe did not erase them. It preserved them. Like the barrels, like the cars, everything remained frozen in place, waiting in the dark. Dating the remains precisely is difficult without recovery operations, which would involve massive legal and logistical complications. But nearby debris, vehicle models, and preserved clothing styles suggest many of the discoveries could date back to the 1950s through the 1970s, the exact years when organized crime activity around Tahoe was at its peak. So far, the Washoe County Sheriff's Office has issued only brief statements, confirming that parts of the footage are being reviewed as part of an active, but the implication is difficult to ignore. The same depth that made Lake Tahoe perfect for hiding industrial waste may also have made it the perfect place to hide bodies. The same freezing darkness that preserved toxic chemicals may have preserved victims too. Cases that went cold half a century ago because no evidence could ever be found may not have truly disappeared at all. The evidence may have been sitting at the bottom of the lake this entire time. And now, officials face a problem nobody wants to solve. The toxic contamination alone represents a massive environmental crisis. Heavy metals leaking into a lake connected to downstream water systems, recreational fishing, tourism, and millions of annual visitors is not some distant theoretical issue. It is a slow-moving public health threat, but solving it may be nearly impossible. The barrels rest at depths that are both dangerous and extremely expensive to work in. Attempting to remove them could rupture weakened containers and release even larger amounts of toxic material into the water. Yet leaving them where they are guarantees the leaks will continue. That is the nightmare researchers are now facing. Some scientists believe disturbing the barrels could trigger an environmental disaster far worse than the slow contamination already occurring. Others argue that knowingly leaving toxic waste inside one of America's most famous lakes is completely unacceptable. Either way, there is no perfect solution, only different versions of catastrophe. Government agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency and California water authorities, have already formed investigative groups and launched studies. Funding requests have begun moving through the system, but government processes move slowly. And meanwhile, the barrels continue leaking. The possible human remains create an entirely different dilemma. Recovering them could finally provide answers in missing person cases that have remained unsolved for 50 or 60 years. But many witnesses are already dead. Potential suspects are gone. Entire criminal organizations from that era barely exist anymore. Would spending millions recovering remains still bring justice? Or would it simply expose secrets some people would rather keep buried beneath the lake forever? For families of missing individuals connected to the Tahoe region, the answer is obvious. Some have waited entire lifetimes for closure. But for businesses, tourism officials, and property owners whose fortunes depend on Tahoe's image as an untouched paradise, the situation is far more complicated. There is another uncomfortable question hanging over all of this. Who allowed it to happen? Because the dumping did not come from a few random people acting alone in secret. Companies were involved, businesses, contractors, and according to historical records, some local officials either looked the other way or quietly helped make it possible. Permits that never should have been approved somehow went through. Inspections that should have happened never did. Complaints disappeared into filing cabinets and were forgotten. The very institutions meant to protect Lake Tahoe may have helped turn it into a hidden disposal site beneath the water. Most of the people connected to those decisions are gone now. Many of the companies involved no longer exist, but the system that allowed it to happen, the shortcuts, the lack of oversight, the willingness to hide problems instead of confronting them, still feels disturbingly familiar. And here is the part that should probably concern everyone. Lake Tahoe may not be unique. What researchers uncovered here could simply be the first example we were forced to see clearly. If deep-water surveys were conducted in lakes across America, there is a very real chance similar discoveries would follow. The drought of 2024 did not create the problem. It only exposed it. Eventually, the snowpack will recover. Water levels will rise again. The shoreline debris revealed during the drought will disappear back beneath the surface. The leaking contamination at the bottom will continue spreading slowly through the water for decades, maybe centuries. If you were in charge of the cleanup operation, what would you do? Would you try to remove the barrels and risk triggering an even larger environmental disaster during recovery? Or would you leave them where they are and hope the corrosion slows enough to buy another generation of time? Let me know in the comments. I read through all of them. And if this story about Lake Tahoe unsettled you, the next one is even stranger. Last spring, divers exploring an abandoned reservoir in Nevada uncovered something nobody expected to find underwater. That video is coming up next. Watch it before another hidden secret rises to the surface.